今天真的是非常荣幸访问奥比大法官。或许我们今天就马上切入我们的主题。奥比，你在很早以前很年轻的时候就失去你的右背，你的右背是由白人政府所策划的一次汽车炸弹案中所失去的，当然也包括您的一只眼睛。刚刚你在演讲的时候，你也谈到，其实你并没有真正的原谅亨利，可是你却带领着整个非洲去，特别是南非，去进行所谓的和解、宽容之路。你真的不恨亨利吗？
When change was coming in South Africa, 1990, Mandela was released, and I was interviewed by an American journalist, Anthony Lewis, who asked me that very same question, don't I feel anger and rage? And I said, Tony, you know, I think there's something wrong with me. I'm a freedom fighter, I should hate the enemy. And I never hated them. I saw them as people doing a terrible job. I was angry with the system. And I think maybe I'm a failure as a freedom fighter. And he said, you know, Albie, what you're telling me is exactly what Nelson Mandela told me, what Walter Sisulu told me, what Ahmed Kathrada told me, what Albertina Sisulu told me. And it became clear it wasn't just personal, it wasn't just me. It was a philosophy of our movement, that we were fighting an unjust system. We had to change the system. Apartheid was bad, like colonialism was bad, like slavery was bad. And we had to transform the very character of our society and, in a sense, even liberate the oppressors who'd also been trapped in an evil system and become narrow-minded and cruel and suppress their own humanity. So in very broad terms, that was the way I responded. In the case of Henry, Henry was the military officer who organized the bomb in my car that blew me up in Mozambique and cost me my right arm and the sight in this eye. I have to think which eye it is, this eye. And I'd never met him. I had nothing personal against him. And he told me that he was going to the Truth Commission. Would I meet him? And he had courage to come and see me, and courage to go to the Truth Commission and become a real South African in that way, telling the truth about what he knew, and then he would get amnesty. And I supported, in that sense, his application for getting amnesty. He didn't come to me and say, Albie, I'm sorry I blew off your arm. How can you do that? And I didn't say, I forgive you, as though it's kind of up to me as a human being to forgive him for all the things that he did to me, to all the other people, as part of the old military apparatus. But I could indicate indirectly that I approved of the fact he was going to the Truth Commission, becoming part of the new nation, giving the truth to the people. And in a strange way, I wouldn't say we've become friends, but he's appeared in a film that's been made on my life. And it's the first time I've heard from him now in 15 years or more through the film. And he defends his role as a soldier. He doesn't make feeble excuses that would make things worse, but he acknowledges the society has moved on, and I think he's happy that the society has moved on. And for me, that's very valuable for him. It's good for me and good for our country.
不过，您在您的书里面也谈到说，当你第一次见到亨利的时候，他想跟你握手，其实你是拒绝的。可是，在之后，他到了所谓的真相调查和解委员会之后，你是的确你跟他握了手，用你剩下的另外那一只手。可是，我想问的是，亨利除了规划、策划您的这次汽车爆炸案之外，他当然也应该去策划了更多。包括对非洲国民议会的这些成员的这些谋杀或者是攻击案件，它当然也造成了更多的家庭或者是你们这些自由斗士战友们的一些死伤。对他们来讲，你选择原谅，是否对他们造成更大的一次的伤害或者是压迫？难道所有的受害人都可以选择宽容原谅吗？
Yes, well, I honestly don't see it as personal forgiveness. We are both taking part in a process. What for me has been fantastic in South Africa is our ideals, the things we were struggling for, have triumphed. We have a wonderful constitution. We had a marvelous president, Nelson Mandela. We saw our country being transformed. We have huge problems. They still remain. We've created new problems for ourselves. But the real victory hasn't been like a personal one. I was in the struggle on the side of the freedom forces. Henry was in the struggle on the side of oppression and racism. What we're ending is the system of racism. To me, that's much more important than doing something specific to Henry. And yet if somebody else came along and said, you know, it's okay for you, Judge Albie, you've got a nice job, life is comfortable for you, you can shake his hand eventually and move on, and say we must move on. We can't do it. We are still living in terrible conditions. We still suffer a lot in our country. We can't forgive him. I wouldn't say that they are wrong, that I'm right. I'm just responding as me. And I can't withhold a real emotion that I have, which is a genuine emotion. I'm pleased to see Henry moving forward. I'm pleased to see him dropping the baggage of the past, the mentality of the past. I'm pleased to see him embracing the new South Africa and the new constitution, the new values, through employing the mechanisms that the constitution sets up. Our Truth Commission is set up under the constitution to open the way to healing, to people coming together. And maybe, you know, maybe it's because we spent so much of our lives denouncing, against. We were aching for a time when we could be for, to create, to nurture, to heal. A big side of our personalities was being suppressed because we had to be so focused on the struggle, on destroying oppression. And so I even get a certain delight, if you like, a deep sense of deep satisfaction of being part of a process that is spreading right throughout the whole country, where people who used to hate each other before are now working together and doing things together. And to see our children playing together in the playgrounds and the sports fields and singing together, for me that's much more important than getting some kind of revenge against a particular person who happened to be one of the combatants on the side of the oppressors.
我在想请教多谈谈您自己跟曼德拉。你不是黑人，你是犹太人。尽管犹太人在当时的处境也不好，可是并不是最被压迫的一个族群。可是你后来选择加入了 ANC， 而且甚至是带领 ANC 去走向南非的一个全新的一个未来。为什么？谈谈你当初的选择。你在法学院毕业之后，你可以有很好的前途，你可以当一个很好的律师，赚很多的钱。可是你却选择了一条最困难的路，为什么？
I didn't stand a chance. I was born into it. My mom worked for Moses Kotane, a very prominent African leader. She was his typist. She would say, tidy up, Uncle Moses is coming. So she had natural respect, genuine respect, deep respect for her employer. My dad was Sachs trade union leader, garment workers union on the side of the workers. I grew up in that environment. And the only thing I couldn't stand was my parents assuming that I would automatically follow what they believed in. And it was only when I was at university that I met a young crowd who were very idealistic and passionate about mountain climbing and poetry and the future of the world, and should we have one language for everybody in humanity? Big questions. Enthusiastic young people, so different from the other students who only wanted to pass exams and become professionals. Then I knew straight away these were my peers, my friends, and they were politically active. So even before I became a qualified lawyer, I was already active. And my first connection with Nelson Mandela was when he was the volunteer-in-chief for the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. 10,000 black people voluntarily went to jail, defying a law that said whites only to sit on this bench, whites only to be in the train, blacks have to show a pass to any police person demanding day and night. They voluntarily broke those laws, and I wanted to join. And my friend said, you can't. I said, why not? Because you're white. But I said, but we're fighting against racism. No, but it's got to be a black-led struggle. And eventually I did sit down on a seat. So he was the volunteer-in-chief, and I was one of the latest volunteers. And we were connected. I'd never met him, but we were connected through struggle. And that was so important in South Africa. People moved by a spirit of resisting oppression, by idealism, by hope for the country, found themselves connecting up with each other, afterwards meeting personally, developing great bonds of friendship. But what really brought us together was the sharing of ideals. So to me, that was so much more powerful than going to court and earning a lot of money, maybe getting crooks off, maybe getting honest people off, defending their rights. And I couldn't separate out being a legal professional from the fight for justice. And I had that funny, strange life. During the day, I'd wear my gown. I'd be Advocate Albert Louis Sachs, addressing the judges in very polite and correct terms in court. And at night, I'd be meeting in clandestine political study groups with a totally different community, where often black people in a self-made shack, candlelight, and you just see the eyes, the teeth, the mouth, and people for whom the law was the enemy. The law threw them into jail. The law beat them up. The law demanded their documents. The law said, you haven't paid your debts. They didn't see the law as a weapon of defense. But justice, they were willing to give their lives for justice. They believed in justice. And they had an energy that my legal colleagues didn't have. And I felt very divided. And it was only when it came years later to writing the Constitution that I felt the great phrases of the ages, the beautiful language of law, can now serve the people who'd been in the shacks with their smiles and their brightness and their passion for justice. The two had to meet each other. And for the grand phrases of the ages to take on real meaning, they had to find a language and a connection with the lives of millions and millions of ordinary people who were terrified of the law, who could now begin to see the law as giving them the vote, giving them rights, giving them dignity, giving them a voice, and saying, just as everybody can count, can vote, so every voice counts, every voice matters. And it was a very brilliant period, I think, for any progressive lawyer to be part and parcel of what we call the negotiated revolution, completely transforming our country into a democratic country and a constitutional democracy, defending the fundamental rights of all, including those who'd been our oppressors, including those who'd benefited from racism in the past. Now they become ordinary citizens like everybody else. And for me, it was quite overwhelming, professionally, politically, if you like, in terms of my consciousness and in terms of my whole sense of well-being. It's not nice to lose an arm. I don't recommend it to anybody. But in a sense, as part of the price of achieving something together with millions of others that corresponds to the deepest emotions you have, the deepest passions, where you've met up with people otherwise you would have been separated from completely, and you have a sense of companionship and closeness and so on. For me, it's been a marvelous life.
也许谈一谈仇恨跟宽容这件事情。在种族隔离政策时期 ，ANC 当然自己也被迫策划了很多起的所谓的恐怖攻击行动。可是 ANC 的成员当然就像您，也遭受了非常非常大的生命上或身体上的这些伤害。可是你们是很早就绝对反对死刑，你们甚至在所谓的抓到了白人政府所派来的特务的这些时候呢，你们选择绝对不能用刑求。为什么？用以牙还牙，以眼还眼，这不是最直接、最当然的一个正义吗？
One of the biggest shocks I've got in my life was when I was called by Oliver Tambo, president of the ANC in exile, to Lusaka, where the ANC had its headquarters at that stage in the 1980s, to help. He didn't say what it was about. And he said, we have a problem. We have captured a number of people sent by the enemy to destroy us, to kill us, to create confusion. And there's nothing in the ANC statutes that says what you must do with captured enemy agents. ANC is a political party. And we're having difficulty deciding on regulations. I said, well, it's not so difficult. The international law says no torture, inhuman or degrading punishment or treatment. And he said, we use torture. I couldn't believe it. We are fighting for freedom and we use torture. He said it with a bleak face. It turned out afterwards he'd received the information. That's why I was called in. And I was asked to help draft regulations that would deal with how to manage and control captives sent to destroy the organization. And we decided no torture. But we put it to a gathering, a conference that was dealing with all sorts of other issues as well.
可是我要插嘴，就是说，假设这个特务，你们抓到他，他正在进行一个非常大规模的对你们的所有成员、对所有无辜的人的一个暗杀，非常恐怖的一个攻击行为的时候，还是不能去对他刑求吗？
That was the very question we put to the conference. I was actually dealing with the report, presenting it to the conference, and the question was, should what was called intensive methods of interrogation be permitted in emergency situations? We put it to the delegates, and one by one they came up. I remember 2 young soldiers from the armed wing of the ANC. One guy, he's probably died in the struggle. He came up and he said, if you give security the tiniest leeway, they'd never stop there. No torture. And the next one said, we are fighting for life. How can we be against life? For me, that was a wonderful answer. That was the whole point. Our strength came from our solidarity, our humanity, our idealism. That's what united us and enabled us to get through immense difficulties. Mandela on Robben Island, others in exile, others in the underground. It was our idealism. And if now we become inhuman ourselves, if we become monsters ourselves, we're destroying ourselves. And we said no torture, and the struggle carried on just as well afterwards as it had done before, but at least we had a moral integrity internally. It's probably the most important legal work that I've done. In effect, something like a Bill of Rights for a liberation movement in exile, before we were even a government. But it represented our morality, our cause. It was very unifying for us. It enabled us to withstand terrible difficulties. Whereas if we were simply doing to them what they did to us, then it's only a question of who is stronger physically. And that was why one element, and it's so important, it came from the top leadership. Mm-hmm. Afterwards, when it came to capital punishment, it was Nelson Mandela who sent advocates to the Constitutional Court to say no capital punishment. We didn't take our decision because Nelson Mandela said that, but it was very significant that he captured something in the psyche of the nation at a time when there'd been such disrespect for human life by the old apartheid state. 100 people would be hanged every year. Mm-hmm. There were gallows to save expense that could hang 6 people at one time. You know, you have to be cost efficient when it comes to state murder. We don't discuss our cases on the Constitutional Court before the hearing. We don't want to influence each other. We had 3 days, not evidence, argument, lots of documents presented to us, and we sat round a table afterwards, and one by one, all 11 of us said, capital punishment is inconsistent with the kind of country our Constitution envisages, imagines we're going to build.
南非是全世界非常早宣布死刑是违宪的这样一个国家。台湾到目前为止，至少有8、9成的以上的民众还是坚持要有死刑。所谓的正义到底是什么？如果我们看到一个人做出来非常非常邪恶、无法容忍的事情，愤怒难道不是正义最重要的一股力量吗？让正义得以伸张，让这样子的人处以极刑，难道不是正义最重要可以维持的一个力量吗？可是南非却选择很早就废除死刑，为什么？
Well, most parts of the world say it's not the natural way, and now in Africa, I've just seen a figure: 70% of countries in Africa have abolished capital punishment, either by law or in practice. and the movement is very, very strong there. And I think if you took a public opinion poll in most of those countries, even in South Africa, a majority would say we want capital punishment because they see it as being the ultimate deterrent and fighting back. But I think the minute people think more deeply and follow through, they realize it doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't do away with crime. The way to do away with crime is to change conditions, but also to capture the criminals and send them to jail for a long time. And what many of us felt on our court was it's not the people whom you're killing, whom you're thinking about all the time, it's us. If we are killing people in cold blood, if we are saying it's okay, in our case, to put a rope around someone's neck and strangle them, or it's okay in America, they poison them and doctors poison them, then somehow we are reducing respect for human rights. And I just feel our country has become more civilized, more humane, more dignified, even though crime is still very, very high, because we don't have capital punishment anymore. And the criminal justice system is working. The problems are still the same problems they had before. We're solving some of them, but capital punishment neither helped to solve the problems of criminal justice system, and it became an ugly feature of our society that I think, by and large, the claim to restore capital punishment is, I wouldn't say it's vanished, but it's very reduced in our country now.
我可能要再请Albie谈一谈所谓的修复式正义在南非这件事情。刚刚在您的这个演讲以及跟吴浩仁、吴瑞仁这两位老师的互动当中，你该很清楚的看到台湾在转型正义的沮丧，甚至我们是几乎承认台湾是转型正义非常失败的一个国际典范。但是我们看到的一个情形是，南非在成立真相调查和解委员会之后呢，有一份民调是2/3的南非人感觉到更愤怒，整个族群的关系是更加的恶化。有90%的这些出席听证会的民众，他们表示说，侦调会只是在收集资料。我想问，你真的认为南非的这个真相调查委员会的经验是很成功的吗？
The Truth and Reconciliation process had a huge impact in our country, and partly because of the brilliant leadership given by Desmond Tutu. It wasn't just that he's a religious leader, tremendous human being, the compassion, the feeling, the sensibility, but balanced out by other people from other confessions and also people who are not religious at all. And they went out and they allowed people to speak out, to tell of their pain, and we saw it on the television, we heard it over the radio. People who'd been not only victimized in the past through losing loved ones or feeling the pain in their bodies, but victimized by the suppression of the truth. Now their stories could be told and heard. That was enormously important for our country. You can't measure how valuable it is. And then people who'd done terrible things came forward and acknowledged it. We got the truth. We were able to discover bodies of people who disappeared, who could now get a dignified burial. The family could learn the last words of those who'd been tortured to death and assassinated. So much came through that was healing. And it meant that we are beginning to become a country that's truthful to itself. Truth now becomes important. This idea that the truth will come out one day infuses everything that we do. It's not on its own. The Truth Commission couldn't itself heal South Africa. As long as we still have millions of people living in abject poverty, we're not going to have full reconciliation. But that wasn't the job of the Truth Commission to do all that. So I think it played an enormously important role at a particular stage, not on its own. Together with the vote, the transformations, the changes, the extraordinary leadership of Nelson Mandela and his team as the head of the government, people working together who'd been trying to kill each other before, a whole series of different things coming together. And it's interesting, in Cairo they had a revolution. How long did it last? 1 year. Had elections, elected prime minister, thrown into jail, 1,000 people shot dead, the army taking over again. We have elections every 5 years in South Africa, free and fair and open. We have a lively press. We have a strong judiciary. We have political parties that contest. There are lots of things that are wrong and badly wrong in our country, and we can't blame them all on apartheid. I often say that we've shot ourselves in the feet. So often we've run out of feet to shoot ourselves in. I don't know if in Chinese you have a similar saying, shoot yourself in the feet. It's your own, you can't blame somebody else. You cause the damage to yourself. So we've done a lot of bad things. There are lots of questions asked about the leadership, about the ANC, but that's part and parcel of democracy. We are functioning. And in terms of material life, 2.5 million people have been given homes free. Brick homes with water, electricity, sewage, which they can build onto, sell on afterwards. Something like 90% of people get electricity now, 90% get water. The child grants for 13 million children. I'm just giving you statistics that there have been actual physical improvements, but still the gap between the very rich and the very poor is still enormous, much bigger than it is in Taiwan, where I believe it's not nearly as big as in many countries in other parts of the world. And many people are angry, but that can't be blamed on the TRC. It's part of our history, played an important role at the time, and now if people are not using the democratic rights that they have as effectively as they should, the answer is to use democracy more effectively.
最后再请教 Albie 是，我知道您非常谨慎，不去介入、直接评论，甚至是指导，特别是像台湾的情形。可是这几天您在台湾到处演讲，在今天您也去参观了中正纪念堂，包括郑南榕基金会、雷震基金会等等。那在前天你也到蔡瑞月那边有一个非常好的一次的互动跟演讲的经验。我想问的是，我很快的举一个例子，有一个年纪跟您现在差不多的叫阮美珠女士，她到现在还在寻找所谓的真相。几十年前究竟是谁杀了他的父亲阮朝日，他不晓得。台湾的转型正义到目前为止，刚刚您谈的非常重要的真相这件事情，到现在还不晓得。我们有很多的受害者，可是我们不知道谁是加害人。从南非的经验，你可以给台湾一些想法、一些方向吗？
And I'm naturally respectful when I come to another country of the internal debates and issues. I'm surprised that I'm even here, because years back Taiwan was the only country that openly supported apartheid, recognized one of the Bantustans, kind of a curious device by the regime to give a little tribal homeland the status of an independent state. One country in the world that recognized it and sent ambassadors there was Taiwan. And we thought, what sort of country is it? I couldn't ever imagine myself coming here, but I've come here and I've been extremely impressed by the vitality of the debate, the passion with which people argue, the liveliness, a very spirited society, and I'm encountering a completely different Taiwan to the Taiwan that very opportunistically sided with apartheid. What I can say, and I'm asked about truth commissions wherever I go in the world, that there's no country in the world that cannot benefit from exploring extremely painful episodes in the past. The form that it takes can vary a lot. In Australia, the Labour government simply apologised for the fact that people of Aboriginal descent, Aboriginal children, were taken away from their homes and given to white families to get what was called a better education. Like 50 years later, 60 years later, but it was very meaningful. In Canada, similar apologies have been given. When Bill Clinton apologized when he was president for the fact that African Americans, then called Negroes, were used for experiments in some medical facilities in prisons in the South. It was just one tiny aspect of the whole issue starting with slavery, but it also got a tremendous response. So I would say every country can benefit from an inquiry. If there are people who are still bearing and carrying pain with them, then the whole society is going to benefit, even if it's painful to hear about the pain of others. And in that sense, I don't see Taiwan as being any different to any other place. What I do notice is that there is great energy. So far, I only know Taipei. There's great energy here. The universities are very lively. The faculties of law are very spirited. The intellectuals are engaging. And that's an issue of the form that the acknowledgement takes. That's an issue for Taiwanese to work out. But the fact that I believe every country, including this country or this part of the world, can benefit from that sort of acknowledgement of past pain, atrocities, repression, whatever it might be, on all sides, that I definitely feel I can affirm.
谈谈同性恋婚姻合法。南非是全世界很快时间透过宪法去让同性恋婚姻透过一个个案的判例，宣布同性恋婚姻是合法合宪的。南非同时也是全世界应该是第一个国家宣布变更性别是不需要强制去进行手术的。可是，在台湾，同性恋和婚姻合法却是一个遭到严重受阻的一个议题。在南非应该有7、8成以上的基督徒，为什么南非可以顺利让同性恋婚姻合法？
I can tell the story about the decision of the court, South African Constitutional Court, to declare that the state was obliged to make the marriage law compatible with same-sex couples registering their marriages. And I can tell you that story because I wrote the decision for the court. It wasn't the first case that we dealt with concerning homosexuality. The very first case we'd heard almost 10 years earlier, and it dealt with sodomy, criminal offense, and we declared that it was unconstitutional on grounds of violating the dignity of a section of the population, violating equality, and violating liberty, freedom, privacy. The next case we had dealt with not decriminalization but equality, and it dealt with home affairs, immigration law, which allowed married spouses of South Africans who were foreigners certain benefits. They could apply for a residence permit from inside the country. They had a right to work inside the country and right to get a residence permit straight away. But same-sex couples, the partners didn't have that. And we declared that the law was unconstitutional, not because it allowed heterosexual couples to do that, but it was under-inclusive. It didn't go far enough. So we didn't strike down the law. We wrote in a provision that would allow same-sex partners to benefit in the same way. We had other cases dealing with pension rights. A judge, Kathy Satchwell, her lesbian partner, she felt was entitled to the same benefits that my heterosexual partner, now my wife, Vanessa, should have, and the court said that was unfair discrimination to discriminate against her in those circumstances. Another judge, lesbian woman, and her partner wanted equal parental rights for 2 children they'd adopted. And again, our court held it's in the interest of the children to have 2 parents and not just one, recognized in the law. And it was a violation of equality to say that if they'd been heterosexual, they could have both been parents. Because they're homosexual, they can't be. Finally, after a whole series of cases like that, we came to same-sex marriage. And we had interventions from the Catholic Church, from other organizations, saying that we will acknowledge the rights of same-sex couples to get protection from the law for their tenancies, for succession, for tax purposes, prison visitation, whatever it might be. But don't call it marriage, marriage belongs to the church, it belongs to us. Mm-hmm. And the court unanimously decided no, that it was a violation of our equality principles. In particular, the Parliament which adopted the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the Equality Clause included amongst the forbidden grounds of unfair discrimination things like race, color, creed, disability, sexual orientation. So we had a very strong indication from the Parliament, which was an overwhelmingly black Parliament, which had already adopted that principle. But in writing the judgment, in saying that same-sex couples have the same right to have their love, their intimacy publicly declared and recognized, and their responsibilities to be publicly declared and entrenched, and the same status as heterosexual couples, the same constitution that protected their rights, protected the rights of religious believers who had different views to maintain their separate views. And in the judgment, I wrote, copying what one of my colleagues had said, it's not useful to call opponents of same-sex relationships bigots. Mm-hmm. And they just see the world differently. But that same constitution protects their rights not to be forced to solemnize marriages that go against their tenets, the same rights to believe for themselves, for members of their family, for their neighbors, for whoever they want, that only marriage is only suitable for heterosexual couples.
在上个月，台湾有超过20万的人上街头，要求不得去通过同志婚姻合法的这样子一个法案。这个人数在台湾的游行算是很高的。我们的行政院长他说，在这个婚姻平权、同性恋婚姻合法的议题上，台湾社会并没有达成共识。我们的总统马英九先生也是这样子的看法。可是您在你的书里面提到，在同性恋婚姻合法国会所举办的公听会的这个过程当中，有非常多积极反对、强烈反对的意见。换句话说，在南非也几乎是没有共识。宪法法院这些大法官像您，并不是一票一票，所谓透过选票所得到的民意基础。透过大法院去做一个这么大的变革，真的是一件好事吗？
What happened in our case was that the court declared that same-sex couples had the same rights in law, that the law as it existed was unconstitutional because it violated freedom rights, liberty rights, it violated dignity rights, and it violated the right to equality, and all three overlapped each other. So it was a very flagrant violation of their dignity and of their rights as human beings, as citizens. At the same time, we sent the matter to Parliament, and we gave Parliament 1 year to bring about the necessary changes. If Parliament didn't act, then at the end of the year, the court would act. So we gave Parliament the opportunity to decide how best to do it. And Parliament decided right at the end of the year, I think 364 days after our decision, they changed the law and they allowed same-sex couples to say, I marry you. And that was passed by a very large majority in Parliament, and was adopted after one of the leaders of the ANC at a caucus meeting had said, we fought for freedom, and when we were fighting for freedom, gays and lesbians were in the trenches with us in the struggle for freedom. How can we enjoy our freedom now when they don't enjoy their freedom? And so Parliament voted for the decision in South Africa. So it wasn't a question of unelected judges. Sometimes unelected judges must do something against the majority if fundamental rights are involved. That's why you have fundamental rights. Sometimes public passions are very high. Sometimes there are minorities that are very persecuted, and people of Chinese origin know what it was like on the West Coast in America in much of the 19th to 20th century. And the majority of white people were very hostile to people of Chinese origin and treated them in a grossly unfair way. And if you followed the democratic will of the people, the courts wouldn't have been able to intervene at all. But some courts, not all the courts, some courts upheld fundamental rights of human beings against prejudice, against that overwhelming kind of emotion. So these are things that have to evolve and work themselves out historically. I'm not commenting on the situation in Taiwan at all. All I can say is that the public moved and changed in South Africa. The public benefited. The more there was serious, open debate, the more gay and lesbian people came out, so that their families discovered it's not some abstract minority group. It's my cousin, it's my daughter, it's my uncle, it's my brother. The more people realize this is a human issue, it's not just a pure matter of law, it's affecting the lives of people we know, people we love, and stopping them from expressing themselves openly. It's encouraging clandestine relationships, lying, blackmail, and people pretending lives that are not really real to them. And now it's very commonplace in South Africa. Same-sex couples are marrying all the time through the public processes. Sometimes you even see in the press 2 men got married, 2 women got married in the social columns, and they'll discuss what costumes people were wearing, what the catering was like, the speeches that were made. And the opposition is very diminished. What we do have that's very ugly in South Africa is in some very poor areas, gross, terrible homophobic attacks on lesbian women. But that's fortunately a remote, isolated phenomenon. As far as the general public is concerned, and it's very much denounced, as far as the general public is concerned, there's been a major shift, I would say, I wouldn't say towards enthusiasm, but towards accepting. Accepting people are different. And South Africans are different. And we've got to get used to living with difference, and maybe it's even good that people are different. It enriches life and society.
除了同性恋之外，或许也请Albie谈一谈，您在书里面用很大的篇幅谈到，透过宪法去制定相关的社会经济的这种权利法案。你谈到在南非开普敦有一个古特邦的一位太太的故事，她跟她的子女们，还有她姐姐的子女们，住在一个非常非常贫穷落后，没有水，然后也没有地下水的水管，没有排水道。甚至没有办法去除所有的垃圾，甚至没有电，极端贫穷的一个地区，他们的生活是非常非常困苦。在冬天雨季来的时候，他们几乎没有办法继续维持他们的生命。可是政府要在这里盖一个重新的都市规划，把这些人赶走了。宪法法院做了一件事情，甚至宣布任何的人，不管你有钱或者是贫穷，你都可以维持最基本的居住权跟生存权。但是南非并没有足够的经济能力去支持这样子一个政策。难道宪法法院可以不管实际的执行面，就只是为了一个崇高的理想，就可以去制定，跳过政府，跳过国会，去制定一个很可能无法实施的政策吗？
Our people felt social and economic rights are as important as civil and political rights. You can't separate the mind from the body. And when people were seeing their children dying of preventable diseases, people living in shacks with the rain leaking in, to say that that's not fundamental, that the right to education not fundamental, to food, to water, ordinary people couldn't understand that. So our Constitution makes these rights that are justiciable, rights that can be enforced as constitutional rights through the courts. Now our problem was, as judges, as your question asks, how can we implement those rights without taking over government? We don't know about budgets, we don't know about priorities, we don't know the best ways of doing these things, and it's not even our job to do that. Our answer ultimately was to follow the text of the Constitution. It doesn't say these rights are immediately enforceable, not even at a level of minimum dignity. It says everyone has the right to access to adequate housing, and to health, to water, food, and so on. The state shall take reasonable legislative and other measures progressively to realize the rights within its available resources. So that's built into the nature of the rights. It's progressive realization over time within available resources and taking reasonable measures. In the famous Grootboom case, we decided, although the state had a spectacularly good housing program that has given millions of homes free to poor people, it had nothing in place to deal with emergency crisis situations, people who were victims of fire and flood and evictions. They had nothing at all. 1,000 people were sleeping out in the open. The rains were coming. They had some plastic over their head, and there was no emergency shelter available for them. We said it was unreasonable not to have emergency protection given to people in deep crisis situations. In another case where we intervened, it was the provision of the drug nevirapine to women pregnant, about to give birth, living with HIV. You take the drug and it cuts the transmission of the virus by 50%. The state said, oh, we have to get experience for 2 years, so we're only allowing the drug to be provided in 2 sites in each of the 9 provinces. Women in other sites were clamoring for it. It was free, it was safe. The doctors wanted it. We said that is unreasonable. We intervened in that case because it was affecting human beings in such a dramatic sense. And I might say the public supported us, and the government changed its policy afterwards, and generally now South Africa has the biggest antiretroviral program in the world. So it's not as though the court is taking over. It intervenes in specific moments where it feels government programs are unreasonable. And the other thing that we've done in eviction matters, there are lots of eviction matters all over the world. It's usually the poor have to make way for development, for the rich, for farmers, for changes of production and so on. And the right to a home is such a fundamental thing. And our court orders there be meaningful engagement between the people threatened with eviction, the state authorities, the landowners. Talk, 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 come back and report to the court, and usually some kind of alternative accommodation has to be provided to allow development to happen. So we are finding appropriate mechanisms for dealing with the matter, and I'm pleased to say our judgments are being read all over the world now by courts interested to find sustainable ways of intervening without pretending to take over government.
相较起台湾的大法官，我们比较容易被批评的是，大法官并不介入个案的释宪，我们是做通则性的去做一个释宪，就是是否违宪或是合宪的这样子一个判决。在这几天刚好我们也有一个叫士林王家，他被政府强制拆除他的家，后来在法院再度判士林王家败诉。我想问的是，台湾的大法官会很谨守所谓的释宪者的这个角色，他们不过度的去解释宪法，甚至不会去扮演所谓的制宪者的角色。可是您在书里面谈到，南非的宪法是在你们这一代手中所制定的，而整个国家赋予或是要求宪法法院做的是要非常积极的去介入种族歧视、性别歧视或是种种的社会不公。难道宪法法院不是在扮演一个更积极的制宪者的角色，而这是合适的吗？
The people who drafted the Constitution, representing the whole nation, popularly elected after intense debate, wanted a court that would uphold the values of the Constitution, and a court that would acknowledge, in effect, our country needed transformation. There's some countries that are basically okay and you need a court to prevent funny things from happening. But there's some countries that are so unjust, like our country was, so unfair. To have justice, you have to have transformation and change. So that's built into the very nature. It's in our preamble, it's in the text of the Constitution in all sorts of ways, that we are aiming to achieve non-racism, aiming to achieve non-sexism, aiming to achieve human rights. It's always seen as something progressive. So the court has got to do that. It's not a court that's just defending the status quo. The biggest worry in South Africa was the court would be too much of the old guard and would be blocking changes. So far from being like that, our court has been quite proactive in transformative jurisprudence. The term transformative jurisprudence was given to us by Professor Carl Clare of Northeastern University in the United States when he visited, and we found that's just the right thing. Maybe the word revolutionary is too profound for judges to be revolutionaries. Parliament can be revolutionary, judges can be transformative, but not revolutionary. On the other hand, equal protection alone wouldn't be enough. The idea of the two big areas were race and gender. And South Africa was, and to some extent still is, a very patriarchal society where women just don't get a fair chance in family law, in workplace, in all sorts of situations in public life. And so that's one big area where the court's been called upon to intervene quite often. Most of the work is done by legislation, by Parliament. But every now and then it might be an old law from the common law from the past. It might be Parliament does something, doesn't pay attention to some areas. Then people come to court, they invoke the Constitution, and we respond. And in a recent survey that was done, I noticed that some clerics get the highest public opinion support. The Constitutional Court comes second. Politicians are way down. Business people are way down. Even lawyers are not all that high up. So there is public acceptance of the work that the court is doing. I think a lot depends on the country. Mm-hmm. A lot depends on how much confidence you have in the legislature, how worried you are about lobby groups, influential, powerful groups, how worried you are about how free information is and how much access people have to information. And one of the important things our court does is it requires accurate information. Mm-hmm. It's a place of transparency. Mm-hmm. And often we say, government, what you've done is okay, but you must prove to us it's okay. So the way one of our professors put it, we've moved from a culture of authority, was that the command of Parliament, the President, the superiors, to a culture of justification. Mm-hmm. And you can justify limiting rights if it's in the broad public interest, but you have to establish that the law is permissible.
我们来谈谈民主跟抗争这件事情。在几十年前 ANC 采取的那样子一个武装抗争，或许是很不得已的情形，可是这个做法让南非达到了一个很大的一个民主的成果。在2013年的台湾，到目前为止，我们其实经常在讨论一个名称，叫做公民不服从。现在的台湾，我们可以选我们的里长，可以选我们的议员，可以选我们的县市长，可以选我们的立法委员，可以选我们的总统。我们是一个一票一票投出来的一个民主机制，我们有非常完整的法律制度。可是我们同样也看到，政府的依法行政情形下，是看到我们的环境被破坏。看到我们的人民合法的住宅被破坏，看到种种我们非常觉得很不公平，但是是依法行政。我想问的是，在2013年所谓的已经达到某种形式的民主的台湾，但是还有种种的压迫不公，采取所谓的抗争是一个好的策略吗？
It's an issue that is cropping up in South Africa. We won the vote after centuries of struggle, decades of struggle. We want the vote to be important. The right of the people to elect their representatives. We want them to be accountable. Our court held in one important case that the legislature has a duty to involve the public in its legislative processes. In one case, we even struck down a law. We declared it invalid because there hadn't been proper consultation. So we like to feel that the connection is an ongoing one, and we made a distinction between formal democracy, which is a representative democracy, voting once every 5 years, and participatory democracy. So we put a lot of emphasis on participatory, ongoing democracy, consultation, listening, hearing, opportunities, the people coming into Parliament, Parliament going out to the people. As a judge, I can't support civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. As a judge, I would understand why it happens, mm-hmm. And I would analyze very carefully the circumstances in which it happens to find out if there is some legal exemption or justification for it. I can't take it any further than that. But to give an example of how important it is to accept the law that we've fought for so hard, 6 months after Nelson Mandela had presided over us being sworn in as judges in South Africa, we struck down 2 important proclamations issued by Mandela at the request of Parliament to structure the new democratic local government elections. We declared them to be unconstitutional. Wow, that's the unelected judiciary recently sworn in, knocking down an act of Parliament that gave the President the power and the President for exercising that power. But we said, as a matter of constitutional principle, and we're not being pedantic, it's important that only Parliament passes the laws. Parliament can't entrust lawmaking authority to the executive, not even to the President, not even the President we love. And for me, what was particularly important was not simply the decision of the court, but how Nelson Mandela accepted that decision. And he went onto television and he said, I, as President, must be the first to show respect for the law as interpreted by the Constitutional Court. And for me, that day was as important as the day when we all voted as equals for the first time. The cameras of the world showed that seemed impossible. South Africa proved nothing is impossible, because it was impossible that black and white could live together in South Africa. Then it became automatic, inevitable when it happened. But that was the day we became democratic. The day Mandela accepted the ruling of the court was the day we became a constitutional democracy. And a constitutional democracy gives space for people to protest, to argue, to challenge, to come to court. If there is environmental degradation, the court is available, and the court has people who are sensitive and responsive and humane, so that they will get a good hearing. They don't have to go out in the streets and fight, because they will get a good hearing in court and maybe get judgment in their favor in the court if they can come up with a legal argument that's appropriate. So in a sense, having a constitutional democracy allows for a form of public dialogue different from the ordinary limited parliamentary institutional dialogue, where lobbies and party political posturing might have undue power and control. It all depends on the issue. It all depends on whether human dignity is being profoundly affected in a way that triggers the mechanisms of the Bill of Rights and the Constitutional Court.
非常谢谢大法官萨克斯访问你，可以让我们很大的提升，非常谢谢你。